I'm Jenny Lee Ryan, Program Coordinator for the Farmington Public Library. Library Director Karen McFeeters and I are very excited about the new Disney Plus movie called Flora and Ulysses, based on this book by Kate DeCamillo. The Illuminated Adventures of Flora and Ulysses. So Karen and I are going to read a few chapters to get you acquainted with the book before you watch the movie later today on Disney Plus. And then we're going to go over some of the vocabulary words because there's just some really fun words in this book. So let's get started. Flora and Ulysses, The Illuminated Adventures by Kate DeCamillo, illustrated by K.G. Campbell, published by Candlewick Press. Chapter 1, A Natural-Born Cynic. Florabelle Buckman was in her room at her desk. She was very busy. She was doing two things at once. She was ignoring her mother, and she was also reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. "Flora," her mother shouted, "what are you doing up there?" "I'm reading," Flora shouted back. "Remember the contract," her mother shouted. "Do not forget the contract." At the beginning of summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora had made the mistake of signing a contract that said she would work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and toward the bright light of true literature. Those were the exact words of the contract. They were her mother's words. Flora's mother was a writer. She was divorced, and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. "I hate romance," said Flora out loud to herself. She liked the way the words sounded. She imagined them floating above her in a comic strip bubble. It was a comforting thing to have words hanging over her head, especially negative words about romance. Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic. Flora suspected that this was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in defiance of contracts. Yep, thought Flora, that's me. She bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing Incandesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as if a jet plane had landed in the Tickums' backyard. "What the heck?" said Flora. She got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Mrs. Tickum running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the yard. "That can't be," thought Flora. "Who vacuums their yard?" Actually, it didn't look like Mrs. Tickum knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge, and the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind, or its engine, or something. "A few bolts shy of a load," said Flora out loud. And then she saw that Mrs. Tickum and the vacuum cleaner were headed directly for a squirrel. "Hey now," said Flora. She banged on the window. "Watch out," she shouted. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." She said the words, and then she had a strange moment of seeing them hanging there over her head. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." There is just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever think you would shout, "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel"? It didn't make any difference, though, what words she said. Flora was too far away. The vacuum cleaner was too loud. And also, clearly, it was bent on destruction. "This malfeasance must be stopped," said Flora in a deep and superheroic voice. "This malfeasance must be stopped" was what unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he was transformed into the amazing Incandesto and became a towering, crime-fighting pillar of light. Unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper wasn't present. Where was Incandesto when you need him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still. She stood at the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Poof! Thwump! "Holy begumba," said Flora.
Chapter 2, The Mind of a Squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought: food. The average squirrel cogitation goes something like this: I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is then repeated with small variations. For example, where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food? Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day. All of this is to say that when the squirrel in the Tickham's backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, here, at last, my fate has come to meet me. He did not think, oh, please give me one more chance and I will be good. What he thought was, man, I sure am hungry. And then there was a terrible roar and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts in his squirrel head, not even thoughts of food.
Chapter 3, The Death of a Squirrel. Seemingly swallowing a squirrel was a bit much, even for the powerful, indomitable, indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickham's birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and shuddered to a stop. Mrs. Tickham bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. For heaven's sake, said Mrs. Tickham, what next? She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. Help, she said. I think I've killed a squirrel.
Chapter 4, A Surprisingly Helpful Cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, for a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person. She went out the back door. Her mother called to her. She said, where are you going, Flora Belle? Flora did not answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickhams in a single bound. Move out of the way, said Flora. She gave Mrs. Tickham a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook it harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur. Vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered. His chest fell and rose and fell again. And then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put a finger on the squirrel's chest. At the back of each issue of The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there were a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled, Terrible Things Can Happen to You. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what terrible, unpredictable thing would happen next? Terrible things can happen to you. Detail what action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happened more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit is realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What to do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended. Run. Locusts eat stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible things can happen to you did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. I'll figure it out, said Flora. What will you figure out, said Mrs. Tickham. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say it tasted exactly like squirrel. fuzzy, damp, slightly nutty. "Have you lost your mind?" said Mrs. Tickum. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small chest. She started to count.
Chapter 5, The Squirrel Obliges. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone blank, black, and then, into this black blankness, there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. "What's that?" said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. "Okay," said the squirrel, "you bet." He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice. This voice was counting. The light receded. "Breathe," the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned.
Chapter 6, In the Event of a Seizure. "Well, he's breathing," said Mrs. Tickum. "Yes," said Flora, "he is." She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. "For heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickum, "look at him." And she chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed. She laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of a fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Mrs. Tickum's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky. Mrs. Tickum continued to laugh hysterically, and Flora Bell Buckman started looking around the Tickums' backyard for a stick.
So one of the things that Karen and I liked about Flora and Ulysses is the wide range of vocabulary words, and we have some favorite words. So you can pick up one of these worksheets at the Youth Services desk, or the link is in this video, so that you can print your own and learn some really fun words. Chapter 5, The Squirrel Obliges. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone blank, black, and then, into this black blankness, there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. "What's that?" said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. "Okay," said the squirrel, "you bet." He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice. This voice was counting. The light receded. "Breathe," the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. So one of the things that Karen and I liked about Flora and Ulysses is the wide range of vocabulary words, and we have some favorite words. So you can pick up one of these worksheets at the Youth Services desk, or the link is in this video, so that you can print your own and learn some really fun words. One of my favorite words from this book is hyperbole. And yes, I read it as hyperbole in my head, but it's pronounced hyperbole. And the definition is extravagant exaggeration, such as mile-high ice cream cones. That is an example of hyperbole. It's okay if you read it hyperbole in your head. One of the other words that I liked in this book was mundane, which has a very not mundane definition. Characterized by the practical, transitory, and ordinary, Commonplace, the mundane concerns of day-to-day life. So see if you can work those vocabulary words into your day and impress your friends.
One of my favorite words is unanticipated, which means not anticipated, unexpected, or unforeseen. That happens a lot. I have unanticipated losing my keys many times. Another favorite word of mine is malfeasance. This is wrongdoing or misconduct, especially by a public official. Don't do this.
On behalf of Karen McFeeters, our library director, and myself, we want to thank you for joining us for this brief introduction to Flora and Ulysses. We hope you enjoy the movie and come to the library. Check out a book. It's a fun read, and I think you'll really enjoy it.